Hello and welcome to another edition of The Tigers Down Under. I'm your host Alex, and with me tonight I have Dan.
Hey, how are you?
Yeah, good. And we also have Brad. How are you, Brad?
Evening, gents and everyone.
So we did a poll on Twitter last week just to get a sense of what people would like to listen to in this period of no City games, and majority of people were after a review of the playing squad for this season, so that's what we're going to do. I might also try and do an occasional episode where we round up media articles from the past week or fortnight as well. But we thought we'd kick things off today with a review of the goalkeepers and defenders for this season. So we'll just run through each of the players, talk about their form for the season, how much they've cost us, whether we'd offer them a new deal, that sort of thing, and sort of just give everyone a bit of an assessment. So bit of an easy one to start off with. We'll look at the goalkeepers first, and in the league, we've had George Long play every single game with 38 appearances, 37 in the league and 1 in the FA Cup. And then we had Matt Ingram, who's played 1 FA Cup match and then 2 League Cup games. Dan, I guess we'll start with George Long. He's one that's, in a sense, he's surprised a bit just because he didn't have a great debut for us last season. But he's really come into his own this season and really sort of backed up that confidence that Adkins had when we signed him at the start of last season.
I think he's really taken the opportunity with both hands and hasn't really looked back. I think it's been a little bit up and down, I would say, throughout the season. Some really strong patches and some patches where he seems to be making the same mistakes. But overall, I've been really happy with his performances for the most part. And I think the fact that basically Matt Ingram hasn't had a look in at all, I guess goes to show that he's impressing in all the right places.
Yeah, definitely. I know when we signed Ingram from QPR in the summer, it was sort of seen as we've now got these almost 2 first-choice keepers so that Long would really be under pressure and not just be handed games. But as you're saying, he's started every game of the season, so he's certainly been in decent form. But as Dan sort of touched on there, Brad, he has been a little bit up and down, and I guess the last few games, which has sort of coincided with the rest of the team not playing particularly well, he has let in a couple of sloppy goals, so he does seem to still have a bit of learning and experience to gather.
Yeah, look, mate, and I think probably the fact that he's been in the position for so long without, Matt Ingram getting a go probably still shows the fact that even though there's mistakes are there, he's still regarded as our best option. You would think with the run of results we've had, it'd be very easy that if he was the problem, that it would have been very easy to make that change. But I think probably barring some silly mistakes, he still is what I think most of us would say is a good championship keeper, and we're pretty happy to have him. But I still think probably in the scheme of things, if we are going to end up in that top half of the table, he might end up being one of those that finds his way doing the sort of Bo Myhill, Matt Duke dance that we saw many years ago, and trying to hold down a spot, if someone can show just that little bit of promise, might be hard for him.
Yeah.
But I do rate him. I do think he's good. He's certainly not our problem. I think some of those silly mistakes, you could almost argue if the pressure on that defence at that time wasn't as bad as it had been in that, especially that last, say, 5 or 6 games before the break, whether those mistakes would have even been made. I think confidence is pretty important when you're a goalkeeper, isn't it?
Absolutely, and I think we're going to get to the end of this season, if we haven't already reached it, and look back and say that probably the peak of the season for us was that FA Cup match against Chelsea, full stadium, Premier League opposition, and he didn't look out of place against Premier League players. He was pulling off some fantastic saves to keep us in that game, and it was probably his match of the season, and it's just unfortunate that since then it's kind of all gone downhill for him. Dan, do you sort of, I guess, concur with the sense that he's basically our number one? Do you get the sense that he could actually improve his game even more if we were to sort of try to progress?
I think it would be hard, like sort of as Brad mentioned, and I sort of said before that it's hard to argue that he's not our undisputed number one as it stands. I think for the most part he shows enough that it would be hard to argue otherwise, and I think he also shows enough that, because he's still pretty young, isn't he?
Yeah,
he's
I think
24 or something.
Yeah,
or is he older than that?
No.
Yes, he's not very old for a goalkeeper. when you look at the last few we've had, and you look at Steve Harper and Alan McGregor, and some of those guys that were up there in the years. So I think he's still got plenty of years of growth and stuff, and he's working from a really strong base. So if we can keep him and keep improving him, and he keeps working with the goalkeeper coaches, and he gets lots of games, because that's that key to improvement is that regular game time and that key to development. So he's on the right track to becoming even better and even stronger, and maybe being that keeper that can take us up the table and hold us in the top half.
He's a baby, really. So as you say, he's still got plenty of time on his side to improve his game. We've sort of in that discussion touched on Ingram as well, who's been a pretty decent professional, as most second keepers have to be, where they're just sitting on the bench most weeks. But didn't look out of place in his League Cup games or his FA Cup game either. So I think he picked up a clean sheet in those 3 games in the League Cup game, I want to say, against Tranmere. And then obviously not in that FA Cup game where we won 3-2. But we'll move on and look at the defenders now, where there's a bit more diversity, I guess, in options to discuss. And we can start with, I guess, the fullbacks and Lehigh, who has pretty much come in and surprised me a little bit, because when you pick up, he was $250,000 from Nottingham Forest, virtually a free signing in that sense that he was so cheap. Older player, essentially forced out of a Forest side who at the time were probably around the same place as us in the table. And he's come in and really been quite impressive when he's managed to get on the park. So, Dan, has he sort of surprised you, or is that sort of what you expected when we brought him in?
No, I would say that he has surprised me. I sort of thought when he first signed, I thought, we've got a guy who's got plenty of experience, in the league and in that position. But I thought they would be chasing another one, and that he might be sort of that flexible backup. But he sort of stepped in and he's been phenomenal for someone his age and everything. And apparently he is meticulous with his training and diet, and I think that really shows with because he is able to. I mean, he's been really impressive for me anyway throughout the season. So he's done a remarkable job for someone that I didn't think would get as many games as he has, to be honest.
Yeah, and given his age, and you sort of look at his so-called injury record, where he has missed a couple of games with soft tissues. He's missed 8 games for the season, which really in the scheme of things isn't that many. He's made 29 starts out of 37 league appearances. So as you say, his diet and preparation have clearly played a big part in that, given his age. Brad, Lehigh, when we're flying, when we're playing really well as a side, there's always passages of play where we play out wide, where Lehigh is really heavily involved on the wing, bringing the ball up the pitch. So he's got that strength in his play of actually really being able to get involved higher up the pitch as well, which for an older guy is really impressive, that he's still able to be much more active in the attacking sense as well.
Yeah, and I think, like Dan highlighted, I think his preparation, his fitness must be pretty superior for a guy that's been around a while, on the wrong side of 30 and still running like some of those younger guys would. And probably the interesting thing for me, and probably the reason why I rate him, is that when he first joined the club, I didn't know much about him other than obviously the Forest background, but it was a friend who's a Villa supporter who actually said they remember him playing a game for Villa years ago where they played with a back 3 and they didn't know what position he was actually playing because he was everywhere. And I still today don't think we could honestly say he's a lock-in for one certain position, because I've seen him play at right back, I've seen him play in the middle, I've seen him play at left back. And he can do it all. So he's got a real adaptability to him that we probably haven't had for a little while. And
probably since Rosinha.
Look, yeah, definitely. And I mean, he's got, you guys would know, we've been obviously reminiscing a lot. You go back to the years of Andy Dawson, who only had a left foot, could only play on the left side. And whenever he got injured, poor old Ricketts had to come across. And with all that, you're sort of thinking, well, here's a guy here that could really fall into any position across the back.
Yeah, and they're invaluable. So I'd certainly be hoping that we'll look to extend his deal. I think he's out of contract at the end of this season, or he might have one of those deals with the option of an extension. Another player who's essentially been our backup right back, and another player who, when I look at that Chelsea game, really excelled and really surprised me, was Mackenzie, who has obviously come through the youth team, and he's made 12 appearances in all competitions, 8 in the league, 2 in the FA Cup and 2 in the League Cup. But he's one who, we saw him a bit last season, mainly playing at centre-back, but he's really sort of come on in leaps and bounds this season at full-back and has looked a really good backup option in that position. So he's one of those guys who might have had his future a little bit in doubt coming into this season, but certainly seems to have cemented himself in the team and certainly done enough to earn a new deal in this summer. Dan, what are your thoughts on Mackenzie?
Yeah, no, he's really impressed me. I think you saw, as with the youth players, because even just this season, we've released probably half a dozen of those guys that are in his sort of age bracket, guys that have been impressive, in some of their appearances in the cup matches and that. Who I think guys like Adam Curry, who I watched, he played in a cup game I think last year maybe, and it was really impressive and looked like he was ready to take the step up. And then I think come this season, and he's somewhere else now. He's gone, and so I think it's been good. He's been really impressive. Mackenzie, he stepped in pretty well. I mean, the standard sort of youth stepping into first team nerves, and lack of real consistency, but he puts his head down, he works hard, and as you mentioned, that Chelsea game, he was phenomenal for a guy that had played less than 10 games or whatever at the time. Like that was amazing.
Yeah, definitely. Brad, do you sort of see him as the successor to Lehigh? Do you think he can take that step up to be a regular first-team player?
Look, yeah, I do. I mean, like you said with George Long, I mean, against Chelsea, you could really see against good opposition, how do these guys compare? I know obviously Chelsea weren't running around with the full first start at 11, but it was still a pretty good yardstick as to how we can value our players, or even look how competitive we could be against that sort of level. I thought for a young man, he was awesome that night. Yeah. I wouldn't say he'd say it was the best game of football he's ever played, but I was more nervous for him than he probably was for himself, because I thought this is where you could get found out on a few things here. But I do think that as far as actually assessing the value on that goes, I think that held its own really well.
Yeah, definitely. On the left-hand side of defence, it's probably not been as successful as those two players have been. Stephen Kingsley, who came in as part of the Klukas deal, really was probably... I mean, we got a great fee for Klukas, which was a great part of that deal, but Kingsley coming the other way hasn't worked out quite as well. He's only made 7 starts with 1 sub-appearance in the league this season, and really being out of contract looks like he's probably on the way out. Dan, what have you made of his time in general at the KCOM, and in particular this season?
Probably one word: frustrating.
Yeah.
No, look, I think he had... I don't know. We had an opportunity. We needed. I think we needed a left-sided defender. We brought one in. He just never really settled, I guess, in the squad. I think injuries. He's just been injured so much. It's really hampered any chance he's had of establishing himself in the first team. And then when he does get games, it just doesn't seem to grab the bull by the horns. He just they seem to pass him by a little. I don't know. Yeah, just been frustrating and pretty disappointing overall for a player who on his, he has promise. I'm not saying he's useless. It just sort of hasn't worked out in a City shirt to date.
Yeah, he's definitely shown glimpses of his potential, and he's had games where he's looked pretty decent. But I guess the common theme, and when we've brought him up on this podcast more often than not, it's been because we just have so much space on that left-hand side that he seems to leave, because he tucks in so close to the centre-backs. Brad, I guess we'll talk about Elder in a second, but he's really come in and just kind of grabbed that left-back position, which probably highlights just how on the outer Kingsley is.
Yeah, and I think probably, mate, we all probably got swept away a bit when Kingsley first joined us about how good he could probably be. But I still think that whilst, yes, there's been issues there with his injuries and he really can't string games, together, I still feel like when he, his age-wise, I mean, he's got so many years still on his side. I think is he 27?
Yeah,
27, something like that.
Yeah.
He still should be, really trying to improve his game week by week. And I just found
25,
like, especially
not even.
25. There you go. So even more so, I just felt like, and just pointing to what one of you guys mentioned before, he seems to get stuck too far inside for a left back, which means is he actually just a left-sided central defender or a left back? I don't know, because his game time's so limited. It's actually hard to get a gauge of what position he actually played in, and I don't know whether his time at Swansea he wasn't actually playing a lot of games there anyway for us to even know.
Yeah. So it's an interesting one. I guess it's one of those unfortunate ones where he's out of contract, and with the club sort of progressively trimming the wage bill more and more each season, you really have to do quite a lot to get a contract extension at the moment. So unfortunately, it looks like he may well have played his last game for the club, but I guess we'll see what happens over the coming months. And then the player who's come in this season, who we've obviously had a lot of focus on, given his nationality, was Callum Elder, who stepped into that left back role quite capably. It was a minimal fee that we signed him for from Leicester, and I remember when he came in, there was a lot of talk about the fact that I think he'd been out on loan at Ipswich last season, made one appearance for them and hadn't really featured otherwise, and they obviously got relegated. So it's a bit of a daunting CV when you look at it, for a player that you're hoping can come in and have an impact. But Dan, look, he's come in and he's really played his part this season, and when he's got on the pitch, he's part of that. I think it was you who was quoting a few weeks ago that back four, when we got those four players playing, Device, Burke, Elder and Lehigh as the back four, we'd barely conceded any goals and we'd won quite a few of our games. So clearly was part of a very successful back four for us this season.
Yeah, he's been really impressive, bar the injuries. They've been a little too frequent, I guess, for my liking. It seems that he sort of has a half a dozen games and then he sits out a few and then has a half dozen games and then sits out a few, but which is frustrating. But when he's on the park, he performs really well, and he gets high up the park and delivers in some really good balls. So I mean, they're the positives. I think possibly just needs. Just maybe just needs to be able to be involved in that full preseason or something. I'm not sure, but a little bit of extra fitness and a bit of extra sort of strength and conditioning. And if he can get to a position where he can play, the 30 to 30 out of the 38 or something like that, you're pretty happy with that. So he just needs a few more games, and he's definitely worth it. I'd probably still take him if he only played half a season, but he's performing much better than Kingsley in that wide left defensive position anyway.
Yeah, I mean, Brad, as Dan was saying, he's been involved in quite a few great moves down our left-hand side, has already got quite a few assists for the season, which is great to see. He's basically excelling in the places that Kingsley wasn't, as you sort of touched on before. I mean, Kingsley playing so tight in with the centre-backs, whereas Elder is much more fluid and attacking down that left-hand side. Yeah,
look, and you're right. I think that's probably the best way to sum it all up, is that when Kingsley's there, we look like we're trying to defend, and when Elder's there, it looks like we can actually counter as well. And I think probably the reason why McCann loved Elder previously and was pretty happy to try and get him on board was the fact that he's pretty decent size and honest for a left back, and he's got a bit of a string to his bow, and he's obviously got the fact that he has played. Well, look, I don't think he didn't play any games at Leicester. I don't think, did he?
No,
he was just out on loan all the time. Yeah, but he's still got experience, and obviously the fact that McCann thought enough to go and get him showed that McCann thinks at this level McCann must think he's a first choice. Otherwise he wouldn't have gone and got him. And I think he showed he is. He probably literally, getting back to what Dan was saying there, if we can get the back four the way we want it, I think he's perfect.
Yeah, I hadn't even made the connection that that Elder was on loan at Peterborough when McGann was manager there, and of course McGann seems to have had a trend this season of signing a lot of players he's managed before. So as you're saying, it's a player that he's known a lot about, obviously.
Definitely, and I think that probably gets back to, look, we can be pretty negative about where we sit as far as the table goes. We know about all the other issues that we could spend hours on today, but the one thing that should come through is if McCann is a decent manager and he's getting players that he knows can perform at this level because of the dealings he's had with them, then that's how you rebuild a squad.
Yeah, definitely. We'll move on then to the centre backs, and I guess the one that I want to start with is a player that if he was able to get on the park for a full season, I would hand him the captain's armband without a hesitation, and that's Jordi Device. And he's one who, when we signed him, was just such a left field signing because he came from Amsterdam, and he was just such a he was PSV Academy, I think, and it was just such a weird place to source a player from at a time when we were starting to go for the Chelsea loanees and the lower league players and all that sort of thing. And he came in and he just struck me as someone who I thought, look, if he can get going, he'll be a great player for us. And of course, all of those sorts of, those European players coming in, playing in a defensive position are going to have a little while to find their feet. And he kind of struggled at first for a little while, but he's almost been, if he'd played the full season, and obviously excluding Jared Bowen, who's since left the club, he'd almost be my player of the season based on just his performances when he's actually got on the park. Dan, what have you made of Device this season?
Yeah, he's really surprised me as well with how much he's been able to step up this season. For a young guy, he is so vocal and so strong and everything. I think I was just earlier this year or last year, can't remember. I was watching one of the city's little videos where they were interviewing players, and it was a bunch of quick fire questions about the squad, and the scariest player, and they all was Device was their scariest player or whatever. Just because he's huge, he's tattooed, he's big, nice and loud, which is all the things you want in a centre back. But he's really good on the ball too. He's got a good eye for a pass, good eye for a tackle. So he's really stepped it up. And I think I have to agree with you in your rating that, like, to say without Bowen there, he's got to be close to, if not of our remaining players, probably the best performer this season.
Yeah, and I guess the big drawback for him has been just the fact that he's only played the 28 games this season because he's had a whole bunch of soft tissue injuries, and it's a frustrating one, whether it's an issue club-wide, because there's so many players who seem to have these niggling little injuries to keep them out for a while. But Brad, Device has how's he struck you this season?
Oh, look, he's the man. And to be honest, the way he operates, although he's, and I love the man, Ian Ashby, but the same number, same sort of mentality, definitely got more skill than Ash, definitely better with his head, probably better with the ladies. But the thing that probably stands out the most is that when he is in the team, we straighten up.
Yeah.
And you look at the games where we really looked this year like we were lost, or goals conceded early, or just look like we're losing some direction. It's where we've either had Burke or McKenzie having to fill into a spot when Geordie's not there.
Yeah.
And I still think, we can go back years and years of great defenders. He's right up there with the best centre halves that we've had at the club if he can play 2 to 3 seasons back to back at that level. We know that he should have the armband. We know that Bowen had a fantastic half of the year, but realistically, Bowen was probably going to be going at the end of this season anyway. Whereas this guy is, again, we're in rebuild. We're trying to build our way back up this championship. We're not going to do it unless we've got a defender like him.
Yeah, and I guess what makes me nervous is there was a lot of talk earlier or in the first half of the season that we were offering new deals to a bunch of players, and I think he was one of the names mentioned, but we've yet to see a deal where he's put pen to paper.
Right.
So I'm a bit nervous that the Allams have done their thing and said, you're on a $6,000 a week contract. You're one of our best players. Here's an offer of $3,000 a week. And he's probably sitting there and going, well, hang on a minute. I don't think that's quite how this should be working. So that's something that I'm a little bit nervous about. I think we've got an option for an extended contract by a year. So I think at a minimum we'll have him for next season. But, I repeat myself so often on this year in, year out about our contract negotiations and how we handle this stuff. But guys like him, guys like Burke, they're the sorts of guys that you see them play for a season or two, you see their talent, you really need to be locking them down to 4 or 5 year deals and just saying, yep, they're going to cost us a little bit more in a wage per week, but the points and the return that you get on the field for them is more than worth it. So I guess we'll see what happens. But in saying that, talking about Burke, his partner in crime, Burke, it's interesting, when Device hasn't been on the field, it's actually highlighted issues in Burke's game this season where he probably hasn't had as good a season this year as he did last year. Big fee for him. It was, I think, about $1.5 million in the end, which is a pretty big fee, which I think was last summer, right when we were starting to tighten our belt. So a bit of a surprise that we managed to secure him, but 30 league appearances this season, and sort of, as we're saying, when he's managed to play in games with Device, that's basically been our first choice centre-back pairing, and we have looked pretty good. So, Dan, how have you seen Burke this season?
Yeah, I guess pretty much just sort of what you've said. When he's with Device, they look almost, impenetrable. They seem to have got that partnership down to a T, and they know, where they've got to be when one goes or whatever. But yeah, when Geordie's not there, Reece just looks I don't know, maybe just a little nervous or something. It might just be that, that because Device is so vocal or whatever, and then all that talk, it settles it down for Burke or something. But he just seems, a little bit off when he's paired with some of the other guys that are available.
Brad, how have you seen Burke? Have you seen, I guess, as Dan and I have covered, that without Device, he's not been as strong this season?
Yeah, which is a bit of a worry because we know, obviously, Geordie's not going to be able to play all 40-plus games a season because he's a hard man. He's going to have knocks, or he's going to pick up a suspension or something like that. But probably the worry is that, and this might get, again, back to experience, is that Burke just seems like he looks like a bit of a deer in the headlights when he's on his own.
Right.
And I don't know whether that's because he's still young, but I mean, you're looking at the age difference. How old is Geordie? Do we know?
So Geordie's just turned 25 in the last month or so, and Burke is, I would guess, around the same age. He might be a little bit younger. Yeah. So he's only 23. Yeah. 23.
Right, but you look at the two of them. I mean, Burke, Geordie looks like a guy who's been playing 10 seasons longer. And just commands it. And I think probably the only thing that I've noticed anyway is Burke, whether Geordie's there or not, he looks better when he is there. But when the ball is around his feet, he doesn't seem to have that confidence that maybe even an Eldar does.
Yeah.
And again, I'm not saying different positions, we know that, but you still at this level, you've got to have defenders who can play a ball.
Yeah.
And I just find that maybe it's nerves, it's a lack of confidence, whatever it is, for a guy who we, effectively, I don't know, actually, does anyone know what we actually paid for him?
I mean, it's all a bit of paper talk. I think it was, call it around $1 million. It might have been, I think the first reports I was seeing was maybe it was, 700,000, 800,000 plus add-ons for appearances and that sort of thing. So
right, okay.
Call it a bit over $1 million maybe.
Yes, I mean, that's a lot to play for a guy who hasn't come in and commanded his spot. We know he's good. Don't get me wrong. We do know he's got some talent, and we know that he obviously knows how to play the position. But you're paying $1.5 million for transfer fees or whatever it is at the moment. You're basically wanting someone to walk straight into your side and control it as well, like Geordie does. And that's what we want two centre-halves to do.
Yeah, and it's sort of telling that in the last couple of games, as our defence was becoming more and more leaky, he was starting to let in a couple of own goals and a couple of, giving the ball away in cheap positions as well. So that's sort of, when the pressure's on, that's when you want your centre-backs to be able to step up and get the ball away and command the area. But unfortunately hasn't quite been the case. But
and probably, mate, that's a really good point. with George Long, George, he's not the most angriest and vocalist of keepers. Like, he doesn't seem to be bossing the back four around like their life depends on it. Without Geordie there, you're really asking Berkey to do it along with George, and then that's not really helping George either.
Yeah, no, definitely. So it's it just sort of all comes back, and I guess Lehigh as well is probably the other one who's sort of been one of the leaders down there. So he's been absent for the last couple of games as well. So all a bit problematic. One of the backup centre backs who we've seen a lot of this season is Ryan Tafazoli, who was a free transfer from Peterborough, and he came in with a reasonable amount of promise. He played quite well in League One, and there was sort of that expectation he'd be able to make the step up. And I think in so far as what we expected from him, I think he's sort of met those expectations. He's been pretty decent when he's come into the team. I wouldn't say he's been awful by any stretch of the imagination. And of course, he scored that wonder long range goal against who was it now? Oh, it's just gone out of my head. Yeah, it wasn't Leeds. But yeah, so I'll look that up. But Dan, what have you made of Tafazoli in the games that he's played?
Look, I think he's been a pleasant surprise for me. I think
Brentford. It was Brentford.
Jesus. Coming from League One up to the Championship, I think you sort of a little bit of apprehension with all of those guys, whether they're actually going to be able to step up. And it was that same. McCann's worked with him. He was just bringing in all of the players he's worked with before. It was like watching Slutsky go out and buy all the players that scored against us. But and so I was a little bit nervous. But I was also a little bit. I didn't think I would wait so long for him to get a chance.
Yeah.
I thought he was going to get a bit of an opportunity earlier in the season, because I think he might have had a couple of appearances on the bench, and then he sort of disappeared for a while, and it wasn't until we then had a spate of injuries that he got a run. He certainly hasn't set the world on fire, but he hasn't been a disaster by any stretch. So he's been a solid acquisition, and considering if it was a free transfer, then happy days really, to get a guy who you can say is a suitable backup in that position, is capable of filling that spot, and to not have to pay anything for him. Great, he'll be on cheap wages and no transfer fees. So
yeah, definitely. I mean, he seems like he's almost just the successor to the Mazouk and the Elphick signings that we'd had previously. Elphick obviously just on loan, but as that sort of third centre-back, third in-line centre-back, Brad, he's certainly looked the part this season. Hasn't really put a foot out of line too much.
Yeah, look, I think he is what we're looking for. He probably just needs a little bit more time. And look, let's face it, the squad's still been unsettled with injury, and not that anyone else hasn't got that sort of problem as well. But he's got good height about him. And he does look like, in the air, he looks like he's never going to get beat.
Yeah.
And that's why I think with Geordie next to him being the hard man, we've got the ability there to really form something that's pretty strong and invincible as a back four, and that's really what we're lacking.
Definitely. I guess the other main centre back to touch on is Pennington on loan from Everton, where look, he had a decent name at Everton, and when he came into the club, it looked quite promising as a signing, as more depth. I think he might have come in before Tafazoli, so he was potentially seen as that third choice at that time. He's had a few changes. I think he's more predominantly played at right back, to be honest, rather than centre back, and he hasn't really looked too bad. But it's just one of those unfortunate ones where he was sort of like Bowler as well from Everton as well, where we brought them in on the just in case we had injuries in particular positions that really haven't had that many injuries. Or when we have had the injuries, he's also been injured, which has been a bit unfortunate. But look, I guess the sense is that we're probably not going to turn that into a permanent deal. But Dan, have you got any thoughts on Pennington, on whether we should pursue him or how he's played this season?
Look, I think if we did pursue him and we signed him on an extended on a permanent deal, I certainly wouldn't complain. I remember the name from when I don't know, maybe when we were in the Premier League, he was probably just about emerging at Everton. Yeah, I mean, I recognise the name. Not as anything, not as anyone who was a superstar or anything, but definitely, I recognised his name, and I was excited at the opportunity of seeing him play in a City shirt. Probably again that I was just it seemed to take a long time. I mean, as you mentioned, there was a couple of poorly timed injuries and things for him, but once he finally did get on the park, I think that first game he played, he was outstanding. He's really strong in the challenge, which I love, and almost all of those, he doesn't mistime them very well. He's got really good sense of that. That I guess it's almost his trademark. That 5 or 10 yard dash, forward sliding challenge to stop that long ball to the opponent's winger or whatever. But no, he's been really good, and I mean, I think it's all that's just gonna be a financial thing. I think especially with everything's going on now. I mean, not that the Allams need any more excuses to cut costs, but I think that's what's going to be coming. Is everything's going to come down to a financial situation and whether we can afford to pay what he thinks he deserves.
Yeah, it's interesting talking to Mitch last week about the whole current situation and these loan players and whether they're going to say, well, the loan now is going to count until the end of the actual season, which could be whenever it is, or the loan is going to count till a certain date on the calendar, which would have been when the season was originally going to end. It's going to be really interesting to see what happens. Brad, is Pennington one that you'd be looking for us to try and sign on a permanent deal, or do you think he was serviceable but nothing special?
Oh, look, I'd like to sign him because I think realistically, if we're saying we're going to try and rebuild, we need 4 decent centre halves or thereabouts that can be adaptable, and he's definitely adaptable. Like Mitch said, playing at right back gives him another. Sorry, not Mitch, Dan. Giving another string to his bow, and he didn't look out of place. I think he's actually probably, out of all the centre halves we've got, he positionally is probably the best out of all of them.
Yep.
The problem, I think, what's going to come is I always sort of question a guy who's been around a while, played at a few different clubs, and can never break it. Like, I know he's from Everton, but we know his loan history. I think we're his 5th club now. He's been on loan to, or 4th, or something like that. Multiple anyway. I know that when he first joined the club, I think they were sort of highlighting the fact that he had played at Leeds and was pretty well loved at Leeds as far as his quality goes. But I think realistically, he's going to come with a price tag that the Allams won't want to pay.
Yeah.
And even if that is just on a wage front, I think the game's just changed now. These guys at big clubs, even if they're not big players, are still used to a Premier League subsidised wage in some way, and I think we're so far away from that now that it just wouldn't be viable.
No, fair enough. And I guess the only other 2 players to touch on very briefly, so McLaughlin, who we signed from Ireland, who's made a couple of appearances, looked really good in the first game and then a bit more shaky in the others, but his first games at this level, he'll certainly learn from that for next season. And Angus MacDonald, who hasn't played this season, but obviously recovered from cancer, which is a huge thing for him and is a huge positive for him this season. So even though he wasn't able to get on the park, that's great news. But just quickly as we finish up, Dan, thoughts on those 2 players?
McLaughlin looks a young guy with lots of promise. Is about as much as you could put it. He, as you said, he came in, had a couple of good games, a couple of shaky ones, but I mean, basically everyone's been shaky in those the last half dozen games we got to play. So it's hard to sort of be too critical of someone who's played half dozen games in the championship. So McDonald, I think I'm almost positive the last time we spoke about Angus MacDonald, I was saying, he just needs a bit of luck. And if everything goes right, he should be able to, make a couple of appearances, late at the end of the season. I'm sure that's what I said.
Yeah.
I'm sure that's what I said the last time we spoke about him. Yeah. And now I'm sitting here going, maybe I shouldn't have said anything. The poor guy. I don't know. I feel I really feel for him. I'm so happy that he's able to, make that recovery and he's back training and all of that. But he has just had a run, hasn't he?
Yeah.
So, I mean, I don't know if he's got an option to extend. I'd extend. I feel like if this is the end of his contract and there's no extension, I don't know if they will. They may just say, you've written the books for the better part of 2 seasons now, and we've not got any games out of you. It might be. I feel like that's probably they might just send him on his way, which would be unfortunate because he had a bit of promise when he first came and had a few good games and just was looking to settle in before, what was it, DVT, the first one, and then it's all hit the fan. But
Brad, thoughts on those two?
Yeah, look, again, I think probably McDonald's the one worth talking about. I think he deserves a crack. Whatever he deserves, he should get. I mean, it doesn't seem to me like he'd be the sort of guy. This is just obviously from a long way away. That's going to hold the club to ransom on wages or anything like that. He just seems like a guy who wants to get on with things and play. And I think this would probably be a good test, mate. If he's got some unfinished business, then the wages won't be so much of an issue going forward. It's going to be more about, okay, how can we keep playing? The one thing that I do remember when he signed originally for us, and I had to look this up to make sure it was right, is he was either captain or thereabouts at 2 clubs I think he's played at.
Barnsley and, can't remember the other one.
Yeah, okay, so Barnsley he would have. I don't know about anything else, but I'm pretty sure he's definitely been captain at more than 1 club. And so if that's the case, again, we're still looking at rebuilding. We're still looking at all the players of past promotion years. We had leaders everywhere, guys who could stand up and just lead. Now, he's obviously hasn't been a captain at 2 clubs because he's a bit quiet in the corner. He's a guy who really wears his heart on his sleeve, and that's what we need.
Absolutely. So just before we wrap up, I was just going to nominate. So out of all those players that we've discussed, I'd probably say the 2 that have impressed the most this season for me would be Long and Device. Dan, Brad, I'll start with Dan, I guess. Did you have any other players that really stood out from that group?
I think apart from the injuries, I would say Elder has really, really impressed me. He's really grabbed the game by the scruff of the neck and taken it to our opposition on the day. So I think Elder's worth a nomination. And Brad?
No, look, I would still say Geordie would be my number 1. But I just on Elder there, I think you've nailed it. I think we've found someone there that is our first choice if he can get the run on and he's got the right back four to play in. That's sort of where you start building a promotion type or a top half. Let's not call promotion. Let's call it a top half team is having some good security across that back four. And I think Elder, he looks like a guy who is always prepared to be instructed and led. He really wants to fit in with whatever's required around him. He doesn't seem to be a guy that can just play his own game. He really wants to play a team game, and that's what we're after.
Definitely. So I think it's been a great discussion because I think we kind of looked at those players and with the exception of maybe 2 or 3 of them, we've got some really good building blocks there and a lot of promise for a team going forward over the next few seasons if we can keep the majority of them together. So it was a great discussion. Really good to look back on the performances for this season, and we'll do another episode either next week or the week after. We'll then look at the midfield. But until then, thanks for joining me, Dan.
No worries.
And thanks for joining Brad.
Cheers, guys. And hopefully we've been half entertaining.
Yeah, absolutely. Hopefully we've helped you guys pass the time during this period of isolation. And until next time, I can't really say come on City because there's no games. But keep safe, everyone, and we'll catch you next time. You've been listening to the official Hull City Australia podcast. For more discussion, join us on Facebook in the Hull City AFC Australian Supporters Group or follow us on Twitter at Hull City AFC Oz. The music was created by Amber and Black.
We're going higher and higher. There's no turning back 'cause you're Amber.